Hello. So in this video, I'll be going over the overall skeletal structure of the brachial plexus. And yeah, let's begin. So let me just start recording. Oh my God. And here we go. Okay, so what is a brachial plexus and why is it important? Well, it's essentially a system of nerves that pretty much supplies slash innervates the entire upper limb. So the shoulder, the arm, etc. And, I mean, clinically relevant because, well, let's say you have a patient who walks in with numbness, tingling, or pain in specific areas of their arm, you could potentially trace it down to a specific nerve or a particular bundle of fibers that might be affecting that region. Um, it's pretty complex, so we're going to start off with an overall skeleton. One thing to keep in mind is a few things. One, the overall brachial plexus essentially has, when you're understanding this overall structure, you want to know that it's kind of essentially surrounding, uh, all the cords are named relative to the axillary artery. So that's essentially part of the brachial plexus vasculature, which you should definitely review. It's definitely useful for this. And also, a lot of the cords will merge together, which is why this can be very, very complicated. Um, so just to start, where does it essentially come from? All peripheral nerves will branch off the spinal cord at some point, and the brachial plexus specifically comes off of C5 up until T1. All right, and let's make a key over here. Um, so key for directions, so yellow will be anterior, and the orange will be a bit more posterior, just to keep that in mind. So we'll begin with the spinal cord vertebra segments. So C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. All right. So do keep in mind that, I mean, you'll probably have to go over this um, overall, but essentially you'll have ventral rami that branch off the spinal nerves, which branch off the respective spinal cord vertebrae segments, and those ventral rami will essentially be, at least within the brachial plexus, the overall roots, and that will be the first segment of the brachial plexus skeleton. Okay, so each root will be essentially named after the spinal cord part it comes off of, and that will be the first part of your skeleton. So let's just draw this out. All right, there we go. All right. Next part of the skeleton. This is probably the simplest part of it. This is where things get a little bit more complicated and things start to branch, not branch, merge. And this is where we have our trunks. So in this case, C5 and C6 will merge to form the superior trunk. And I may have said this before, but pretty much most of these roots, cords, trunks are named in their just like their position relative to each other. So it's kind of easy to sort of follow in terms of where they are. That's probably what they're named. All right. So if this is the superior trunk and this is C7, which kind of stays in the middle, this will now be the middle trunk. And similarly, with C8 and T1 merging to form a trunk 2, this will be the inferior trunk. So keep in mind, we have our superior, which is C5 to C6. Oh, let me rewrite that, sorry. Um, C5 to C6, middle C7, inferior C8 to T1. One way you can kind of remember that C7 is just kind of in the middle and alone because it's like the middleman. It gets C6 and C5 together, and then C8 and T1 together, but it will always be lonely and sad. So that's how I remember it. Maybe it'll help you too. From the trunks, this is kind of where you'll actually start to form divisions, and those divisions are essentially the anterior and posterior components I was mentioning in the key above. So from the divisions, you will have your superior trunk have one of its segments continue on to form an anterior division. You'll have the same thing occur with your inferior trunk having an anterior division. However, your middle trunk will continue on to form the posterior division. Let me redraw that, sorry. Okay. posterior division. And now we're not actually done here just yet. There's actually more branching occurring. Off each the superior and inferior trunks, you will have a branch that actually joins with the middle trunk in the posterior division. So you'll have a branch off the superior trunk come and join the posterior division, and same with the inferior trunk. Now, what does this mean regarding these divisions? The posterior division will have signals coming from each one of these roots. So if you can follow, let's work backwards here. So from this meeting point in the posterior division, we can go all the way back and trace our initial starting point from T1, for example, even though the middle trunk directly comes from T7. The same thing occurs with C6. We can go back, back and back and back, and find that we have fibers potentially coming from C6. So that's essentially what the divisions are as part of the skeleton of the brachial plexus. These divisions will now then reorganize themselves into three different cords. So the anterior division of the superior trunk, as well as an interior division of the middle trunk. So it'll come off of here. It's a little bit more tricky, but it's once you get it, you'll get it. You'll have an anterior division of the middle trunk and an anterior division of the superior trunk. Let's put that there. They will merge to form together the lateral cord. Right? And these are the chords here. Let me put that up. Our posterior division will proceed into where essentially the posterior cord. And do keep in mind this is essentially a point where all three trunks actually merge, because if you see here, the superior and inferior trunk both branch off into the posterior division and eventually will merge together to form the posterior cord. So while the lateral cord actually contains signals from C5 all the way to C7, because you have a part of the middle trunk merging into the lateral cord, C5 to C7, which is actually different from the superior trunk. The posterior cord will contain segments or signals from C5 all the way until T1, because you have branches coming off of each one of these roots, and eventually some of them will merge into the posterior cord. Lastly, the anterior division of the inferior trunk, inferior trunk will continue on, will continue on to form the medial cord carrying fibers from C8 to T1. So do keep in mind that in comparison to all the other chords, there's not really a change that occurs in terms of where the nerves slash fibers in this cord are coming from. Whereas you have to know that while the lateral cord at some point, if we just go back normally, proximally to the spinal cord, the superior trunk is C5 to C6. But the superior and middle trunk eventually merge together at some point to form the lateral cord, therefore forming C5 to C7, at least anteriorly speaking. However, the superior trunk has a posterior division, which merges with the middle posterior division to form a cord called the posterior cord, which goes from C5 to T1, whereas the middle was initially just C7 and superior was just C5 to C6. So be sure to keep those differences in mind when constructing the primary base skeleton of the brachial plexus. In the next segment, we will try to go over the different nerves based on the chords they're on. And hopefully this part so far has helped you. And try to just get a better understanding of it, and we'll move on to the nerves. Okay, so hopefully based on the previous segment of this video, you have an overall understanding of the skeleton of the brachial plexus. So with this in mind, let's get started with some of the nerves that branch off the brachial plexus. But before we get onto the chords where most of the nerves sort of branch off of, I kind of want to talk about three nerves that we've talked about in class, and they sort of come off of the roots slash trunks. So the first nerve I'm going to talk about is going to be the long thoracic nerve. So it looks kind of like this, where it sort of runs posteriorly. It starts off at C5, the root C5 root, goes down and down and down and down and down, and this is the long thoracic nerve. It's important to know that for this nerve, we actually have branches not just coming off of C5, but also C6 and C7. So essentially, it's a C5 to C7 origination from these roots specifically. And this nerve specifically innervates the serratus anterior muscle. Serratus anterior. And that muscle is essentially laying between the scapula and the rib cage on the back. And what that does is that essentially holds that scapula down, keeps this together, assists with movement, all that kinds of stuff. It's very sturdy, very stable. And this is an approximate diagram of what it looks like. So this is in this section where it's like we're looking from the side. This person is looking that way, very happy, yep, yay. Here's the scapula. Here's the ribs, obviously. And this would be the serratus anterior. Okay. The next nerve we'll be having is called the dorsal scapular nerve, and that specifically it kind of just branches off over here, off of the C5 root. And the dorsal scapular, let's put that down right here, dorsal scapular, C5, specifically innervates two muscles, and that would be the levator scapulae and the rhomboid muscles. So there are two rhomboid muscles, rhomboid major and minor, and the levator scapulae. If we look at this overall diagram here, if we're looking from the posterior side, this would be the green segment would be the levator scapulae. So between the scapula, it goes up the neck. This blue segment over here would be the two rhomboid muscles, or both rhomboid major and minor. The last nerve we've talked about in class that sort of doesn't come off the main cords is called the suprascapular nerve. So it kind of branches off a bit off the superior trunk. So let's start maybe here and keep going this way. And the name of it is the suprascapular nerve, so suprascapular nerve. And we have to consider, since we've seen here the dorsal scapular and the long thoracic nerve have origins at the roots themselves, and it's kind of easy to see that. So let's just specify this branch here. And suprascapular nerve actually, because it comes off the superior trunk of the brachial plexus, it'll actually include fibers from both the C5, C5 and the C6 roots. And the suprascapular nerve specifically innervates the muscles, um, both the muscles called the supra and the infraspinatus muscles. And these would both be found in the rotator cuff. So if we scroll down here to my beautiful sketch of a posterior scapula, this region overall is sort of like the rotator cuff. There's a few muscles here, and the top part, apologies, the top part would be the supraspinatus muscle. So this little magenta pinkish kind of thing. And the green one over here is kind of larger, and that would be the infraspinatus muscle of the rotator cuff. So those are the nerves that are sort of outside the cords, and next we'll get into the cords at the next part. All right, so hopefully you got the few nerves on this side down. So the suprascapular nerve, the dorsal scapular nerve, and the long thoracic nerve. I've kind of put down some diagrams of where those muscles with respect to those nerves can be found. Now I want to go over the first cord being the lateral cord. As you can see in my key, I have decided to color code all the nerves respective to that lateral cord as blue. So the first nerve that we're going to be covering with respect to the lateral cord is going to be the lateral pectoral nerve. So the lateral pectoral nerve, let me just get my color, sort of comes off around this point, let's say around here, okay? And we're going to label this with number 1. And the lateral pectoral nerve is actually just simply responsible for innervating, all right, lateral pectoral, right? So lateral pectoral right over here. I'm just going to name it, put numbers because there are going to be a bunch of other nerves and I don't want to clutter it with too much words. But this is essentially going to innervate the pectoralis major muscle. All right. So that muscle is essentially, if we look at this anterior, beautiful um, sketch of an anterior person, let's say the pectoralis major will be roughly around here. It's a pretty big muscle. Um, not, it's pretty easy to find. So pectoralis major, that's essentially innervated by, let's say, like, yeah, roughly here-ish. Maybe if we go a little bit below the shoulder level. So let's go here. That would make more sense. That's innervated by the lateral pectoral nerve. The second nerve that's associated with the lateral cord is going to come off, essentially, actually off of uh, just further on laterally, I guess, and that would be the let's call this number two. It's a pretty big nerve. We'll go. You'll probably see it more later on, and that'll be the musculocutaneous nerve. Musculocutaneous. Okay. And the significance of the musculocutaneous nerve is that it's essentially, well, yeah, it's a branch directly coming off the lateral cord, but it's essentially supplying a lot of the interior muscles within the arm. So muscles such as okay, wait, let me just be sure I have this, the pectoralis major. So a lot of muscle, okay, going back to the musculocutaneous nerve, that'll include muscles such as the coracobrachialis nerve, coracobrachialis, as well as other nerves in the interior, other muscles, sorry, in the interior arm. So, like the biceps brachii, I believe, and the brachialis. And essentially, if we want to find where those are, so let's say this was blue, we'll put this as like orange, so it'll be kind of roughly in this area. And then the musculocutaneous nerve will, in general, look at a lot of the other muscle groups within the anterior arm. The third major component of the lateral cord is actually just called the essentially the lateral root of the median nerve, and that's going to come down sort of like this, okay? And it essentially will merge with another root from the medial cord to form what is called the larger overall median nerve. Um, Essentially, yeah, that's all it's really meant, like known for doing, I guess, based on the stuff we've talked about in class. And yeah, hopefully that kind of gives you an overall understanding of what the three overall groups are. So let me do lateral side of median nerve. Yeah, okay. So hopefully that gives you an overall understanding of the lateral cord, and we'll go into the medial cord next. All right, so hopefully you understand the lateral cord. And now for this next segment, we'll talk about the medial cord. So that would be this portion of the um, brachial plexus, right? And that specifically refers to the roots C8 and T all the way to T1. So these two over here. So the first nerve we're going to be talking about is going to be called the medial pectoral nerve, okay? And the medial pectoral nerve would be somewhat, all right, by the way, I'm color coding medial cord to be purple just so we can sort of have a differentiation there. And this one will sort of come off right over here. So I'm going to label that, let's see here, number one. And this would be the medial pectoral nerve. Medial because it's medial side, and the pectoral because it actually just innervates two pectoralis muscles. So that would be both pectoralis major, so pectoralis major, and pectoralis minor. So in the lateral cord section, we've talked about how the lateral pectoral nerve innervates pectoralis major only, whereas medial innervates both major and minor. So you can remember it like this, right? We talked about this in class. So medial starts with M, which also corresponds to the word more, and that would be both major and minor. So it innervates two nerves, not nerves, muscles in the chest. Whereas lateral is less, so therefore only major. So what does this look like? So let's say pectoralis minor is orange. We'll put that like maybe here-ish. And then pectoralis major is blue. And that would go right above here, kind of like in the previous diagram up here. It's an approximate sketch, you get the idea. The second nerve that falls under the medial cord is going to be called the medial brachial cutaneous nerve. So right here. Let me fix that. There we go. Okay. And that'd be kind of, right next to the medial pectoral nerve. So let's just put this over here, number 2, purple. And what this is responsible is, well, we look at the um, overall word roots. Medial, so it's on the medial side, brachial, so arm, and cutaneous, so skin. So it's a primarily sensory nerve, and what it does, it essentially detects sensory input from the skin of the medial arm. Medial arm, okay? The third nerve within the medial cord is going to be the medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve. So medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve. This one's a little bit different because it is also sensory, but the key difference is it's the skin of the medial forearm. So forearm specifically, all right? And um, both of these are sensory, so please do keep that in mind. They do not innervate any muscles. And that would be maybe, let's say, roughly here, or an approximate sketch. Our fourth nerve is going to be the ulnar nerve, okay? And that is essentially coming straight off. It's the medial branch, it's the normal branch, I guess, of the medial cord, and that would be the ulnar nerve, as I just said, right? And the ulnar nerve essentially is, it does have some sensory input, particularly to like some of the medial fingers. But it also does a lot of the work in terms of providing motor output to much of the hand, right? So medial hand and motor output to the hand in general. Hand. All right. And then one thing to keep in mind actually is that it apparently contributes to the funny bone. And what that essentially means is like sort of goes in your elbow, right? So when you slam the little gap thing within the elbow on a surface, that causes it to sort of tingle and feel weird and whatnot. It's pretty sharp. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And that's due to actually compressing the ulnar nerve. So that's kind of where it comes from. And that'd be like here. Yeah, okay. The last nerve within the medial cord section is actually going to be um, the medial root of the median nerve. So medial root of median nerve. And this doesn't actually innervate any specific muscle. It's kind of just like the lateral root of the median nerve, where off the medial cord we have this little nerve piece branching off to eventually form the nerve right over here. And this would be number 5. Hopefully this medial cord section of the brachial plexus makes a bit of sense. And we'll be moving on to the posterior cord next, which is the final one. Okay, and now for the final section, we will be talking about the posterior cord. Lovely, lovely. Um, Before I get into that though, I want to first acknowledge the median nerve. So essentially we have the lateral cord, we have a segment of that coming off, and then a segment of the medial cord coming off, and they both come together like this, branch over here, to form the median nerve. So the median nerve is pretty important. So let's just hold on, median, and it's got roots from C6 to T1. And essentially what it does is it sort of follows the brachial artery down to the cubital fossa, and it has a lot of roles within like palm sensation. And on top of that palm sensation, it also has a lot of motor involvement with the thumbs, the wrist. So whether it's like flexion, slash pronation, it has pretty significant roles in those. And it does pass through the carpal tunnel area within the wrist. So that's essentially the role of the median nerve. And now, let me just write that. And now we'll move on to the posterior cord. For the posterior cord, I just wanted to quickly color code that and make that red just because it's easy to see. And for the first nerve in the posterior cord, we'll essentially be looking at, let's see, uh, what's it called? Sorry, the upper subscapular nerve. So right over here, scroll down, upper subscapular nerve. And what this nerve particularly is responsible for doing is it innervates the muscle called the subscapularis. And that muscle is essentially located on the rotator cuff, so on the scapula, but like towards the front of the shoulder. So essentially, this is the anterior side of the scapula. It's pretty much located roughly around here or something like that. That's kind of the gist of it. The second muscle that's part of the posterior cord is the thoracodorsal muscle. Thoracodorsal um, nerve. Sorry, not muscle, nerve. I misspoke. And that would essentially be right next to these upper subscapular nerves. So kind of like here, it's pretty simple to follow. As you can see, a lot of these nerves within the medial and posterior cord are kind of like next to each other. A lot of cords are a little bit different, but you know, whatever. Hopefully that helps you just a teeny bit. And the thoracodorsal nerve is primarily responsible for the latissimus dorsi muscle. So that would be like your lats. So when you're doing a lat pull downs, when you feel the burn there, and when you're working out that muscle at the gym, that's essentially this is the nerve, thoracodorsal muscle that's responsible for that. And as we all know, the lats are like roughly around here on like both sides. I don't, I'm not gonna put the perfect shape down because you get the idea. It's on the posterior side, as you can see in the diagram here. The third nerve that's part of the posterior cord is going to be the lower subscapular muscle. So lower subscapular muscle or nerve. Oh my God, sorry. Nerve. And this has a role particularly with the teres major um, muscle within the posterior shoulder. So teres major is kind of like it's kind of like on this, it is like on the scapula, on the posterior side. So if this is the scapula here, here's the scapular spine. Teres major would be located kind of, let's put this really small, make this like green or something, would be located somewhere down there. All right. It kind of runs along the bottom of the scapula, roughly in that region. Our fourth nerve that's within the posterior cord is going to be the axillary nerve. This one's also a pretty major nerve. It is responsible for two muscle groups. First one being the deltoids. So when you're doing the shoulder presses, that's where it goes. That's the nerve responsible there, as well as the teres minor muscle. And uh, basically, in addition to that, it actually also supplies sensory input of the skin on the posterior shoulder. So if we go to our diagram here, we look at the deltoids would be kind of like here, as we know, here, and the teres minor muscle would be right above the teres major, so like kind of like there. So maybe it'll be a little thinner. Sorry, a little thinner, kind of like that. Rough approximation of where the muscles are. It'll probably be better if you look at an actual diagram. This is just a reference point in case you couldn't tell. And the axillary nerve in the diagram will kind of actually just, um, honestly, just kind of just branches off on its own a little bit. So like rather than going straight, it kind of just goes off like here. Oh, let me make that go under. Let's label that as 4. And now the final nerve within our posterior cord is going to be the radial nerve. Okay, so can I get the idea of where those nerves are? Oh, our lower subscapular muscle nerve would be here. Anyway, going back to the radial nerve, this will go straight out the posterior cord, and what it essentially does is, in case the name wasn't making it obvious, it kind of travels down the radius, right? Um, not 4, 5, radial nerve, and that essentially kind of is more responsible for pretty much every muscle in the posterior arm. So posterior arm muscle. So that would be stuff like the triceps, for example. That's a pretty well-known muscle. Um, but also, like in addition to the muscles here, like the triceps, for example, it also does take in sensory input. So lots of the posterior forearm and arm have sensory input from this nerve, and in addition, it is pretty so sensory input of posterior arm. And lastly, it does have involvement in movement. So stuff like the extension of shoulder, the extension of the wrists, and other areas within the arm have an influence on the radial nerve. So hopefully this long video kind of gives you an overarching view of the brachial plexus. I try to simplify it down a little bit. It is kind of complicated, but hopefully the skeleton kind of gives a framework of what the brachial plexus is composed of and how you can sort of trace back, like, oh yeah, this is um, the lateral cord. It branches off into several nerves. As you can see, here's the lateral pectoral nerve. Um, as we know, the medial pectoral nerve goes to the pec major and minor. So if there was a problem with the pec minor, a pectoralis minor muscle, you could probably trace it down to the medial pectoral nerve, as the lateral pectoral nerve is only for pectoralis major, for example. So hopefully this video helps, and good luck with the brachial plexus. Thanks.